Hey, I'm Torben. I'm a writer, a poet. I publish a newsletter on Substack, and today I'm going to read a poem from that Substack and just talk about it sort of in the terms that I use on the essays that I write that accompany the poems, but a little more, a little less structured, I should say, than I do in the newsletter. So just to kick us off, here's the poem. It's called "No One Writes in Meter Anymore." A verse not bound by rhyme and beat appeals more to the young. Unlike the martial march of feet, they prefer a barefoot tongue. But like a shoelace binds its boot, constraining where the foot can move, but making more productive steps, rhyme and meter have the same effect. So this poem is basically about the difference between meter in poetry and free verse poetry. So I guess you could call it traditional poetry versus like more modern, more free verse poetry. If anyone's not familiar, free verse poetry is just poetry with no rhyme and no meter. There's also something called blank verse poetry, which is poetry written in iambic pentameter, but without any rhyme. So free verse is like no meter, no rhyme, nothing. It's just, it sounds like normal speech. It sounds like you were just listening to somebody talk, or you were reading any other kind of prose. The only real thing that marks it off to the, I guess you could say, untutored eye is that it has line breaks. So a free verse poem is essentially prose with line breaks. I'm being a bit flippant in describing it like that, but I don't think that that's a terribly unfair characterization. So the poem that you've just listened to me read, I'm sorry if you can hear my dog walking around. His toenails are a bit long and he clacks on the floor. The poem that you've just heard me read is basically an argument in a poem. It's like a poem. It's an argument shaped like a poem that argues for the presence of rhyme and meter in poetry. So I'm saying, or the speaker of the poem is saying that rhyme and meter in poetry are a good thing. And the metaphor that they use to make this argument is a shoelace and a boot. They say, or I say in the poem, the speaker says is like a way that you can kind of, the speaker is like something that you can hide behind as a poet. So when you're describing the opinions expressed in the poem, you can say the speaker says, and as a poet that allows you to kind of like hide behind them a little bit, but also to explore like different opinions and different ways of thinking without fully committing to them. I think that's a great thing to do. I think it's good to like explore thought without necessarily committing. Back to, that was a bit of a tangent, back to the plot. The speaker of this poem says that rhyme and meter are like a shoelace binding a boot. So when you put on your shoe or your boot when you're going out for a walk, you tie up the shoelace super tight or however tight, and then you go for the walk, and your foot is like less free. It's not able to do anything that it wants. Maybe you can't wiggle your toes as well. Maybe you can't feel the ground as well when you're walking. However, the foot functions a little better than it might without that boot, without that shoelace being tied tightly around the boot. And that's because, well, the boot allows you some stability, it gives you some stability, it gives you the ability to walk further with less pain. Maybe it makes you a little faster at walking. I know there are maybe barefoot runners out there who would disagree with me, but in general, I think that shoes are widely accepted as an improvement to normal foot walking. So That's the metaphor that the poem uses to argue for why rhyme and meter are good in poetry. So the parallel is that rhyme and meter like constrain what you are able to say. You know, if you have to fit something into a metrical line, it's you have less options. You can't just say whatever you want. You can't just act as if you're talking to your friend. You can't act as if you can't speak in the same way that I'm speaking to you now. You have to like conform to some restrictions. So those restrictions are whatever meter you pick to write in. So that could be, you know, iambic pentameter, just for example, the meter that Shakespeare mostly wrote in. There are lots of other examples. That's just a very common one. So you're forced to stick with that meter, and then let's say you pick a rhyme scheme like ABBA, and rhyme ABBA. You have to stick to that too. So that means that you have to fit your lines in this meter, and the last word has to rhyme with the last word in another one of the lines. So those are your kind of your constraints. But once you apply those constraints and learn to work within those constraints, the poetry actually gets better. It's like the foot walking in a shoe is a more effective foot. The poem written with rhyme and meter is a more effective poem. That's the argument of the poem. So this, I guess, has the historical context for the writing of this poem, like why I wrote it, is that I originally actually started with free verse poetry. So when I started writing poetry, I did not ever have, rhyme or meter in my poems. I just wrote whatever I wanted, you know. One line would be super long, one line would be super short. There were no metrical feet in it. Note tangentially the pun on foot and feet in poetry, like a metrical foot. So when I started to write poetry, I only wrote free verse. I wrote whatever the fuck I wanted, pardon my French, and I never applied rhyme and meter. And I did that for years, actually, before I decided that I would start to maybe write in rhyme and meter. And I guess I got to give a shout out to Adam Katz, a very talented poet who kind of encouraged me to do that. He was sort of very critical of my free verse poetry, rightfully so. I now share many of his opinions, and eventually I started writing in free verse. In order to do that, I started writing in traditional verse. I started writing with rhyme and meter. And in order to do that, I read a lot of traditional poetry, old poetry, you know, take your pick, Tennyson, Keats, Marvel, whoever you want. I read the entire Fairy Queen, which is like a long book of very traditional meter. I read a lot of stuff in meter. I started writing in meter. After a while, I was pretty much able to like consistently just mentally churn out infinite lines of iambic pentameter. I would just walk down the street and like describe what I was seeing in iambic pentameter. I still have that skill. I haven't lost it. I'm pretty much able to pump out poem content. I'm pretty much able to just write iambic pentameter lines ad infinitum, infinitely, indefinitely. And yeah, so that's kind of brought me up to where I am today. If you're a newsletter subscriber, if you read my newsletter, you'll notice that all of the poems are in meter. A lot of them are in iambic tetrameter. Some of them are in iambic pentameter. And most of them are iambic. That's a very natural rhythm for English writing. There are other options as well. They feel a little bit more strained. The I am as a foot, which if you're interested, I can define it. I can go into more detail in another video. Yeah, so I write a lot in iambic meters now. Tetrameter, which means 4 beats per line. Pentameter, 5 beats per line. And I think that my writing is actually better. And one of the reasons that I think my writing is better as a result of switching from free verse to traditional verse is that I've had to express myself more simply. And the reason for that is this. When I would write in free verse, I would just write the most kind of complex subject matter that I could. So one thing to understand is that I was a philosophy student. I did my undergraduate degree in philosophy, and I was very interested in complex ideas and big ideas, in thought. I was interested in thought, and I would try to express a lot of these sort of quote unquote deep thoughts in my poetry. I would get very deep into the language and try to make the most sort of intricate, complex poem that I could, but that didn't always end up creating the best product. And when I switched to traditional verse, because of the difficulty of writing in a meter like pentameter or tetrameter, iambic, I was forced to write on more simple subjects. So instead of describing, like Hegel's, Lord Bondsman dialectic or something like that, or instead of writing just any kind of very dense poem with philosophical or literary allusions, I was turning to describing stuff like my walk, what I was seeing on my walk, or the coffee that I was drinking, whatever. I was describing very mundane subjects, and because I was doing that because I was focusing so carefully on the meter instead of the content. I was focusing on the form instead of the content, and so actually, as a result of having focused in on the content, I've ended up expressing my ideas more clearly. Sort of at this point, I'm back to writing more difficult subject matter, but I've on the way brought greater clarity to it through this kind of passage, through meter. It's essentially been a vehicle for making me a better poet. And I guess this is kind of the conclusion of the argument. I don't actually think that writing in free verse is inherently worse than writing in traditional verse, metered rhymed verse, whether that's syllabic or accentual syllabic. What I actually think is that you should probably do both. And in all likelihood, I'll return to free verse later on. I don't know, maybe this year, next year, whatever. I'm not in a rush to do it, nor am I resistant to doing it. I think that it's something that in all likelihood I will do again in the future. But I am grateful for the time that I've spent writing free verse, traditional poetry, because it's made me a better poet. It's imparted greater clarity to my work. It's made me think harder about the decisions that I make in poetry. And yeah, so you know what? If you're a poet, I would recommend writing in traditional verse if you haven't tried it yet. If you're a hardcore traditionalist like me, maybe try free verse. And if you are not a poet, I would recommend reading some traditional poetry. I like Keats. I like Andrew Marvell. And I would really recommend reading that stuff because it's a musical joy to experience it. And yeah, that's all for now. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If anybody watches it, I hope they enjoy this video, I should say. and let me know what other videos I should make. I would love to do more of this if it's at all appreciated by you, the reader. So take care.